Trev's Hockey Show. I'm the Trev. That's too sweet. Anyway, continuing with retired numbers. And today, we're going to talk about the second number retired by the Los Angeles Kings. And, well, for today, we're talking about probably not only the greatest player, statistically anyway, for the Kings, but also one of the best players in league history to not have his name on the Stanley Cup. And that's kind of a shame, but you know, things happen the way they happen, especially in the game of hockey. I mean, you're never really guaranteed a chance with the cup. Such is the case. But today, talking about one of the key pieces, not only to the Kings, but also to the Triple Crown line, and that being player awarded number 16, which is Marcel Dionne. Let's talk about it. Alright, so Marcel Dionne's 11 and a half seasons with the Los Angeles Kings began on June 23rd, 1975. And that'd be when Dionne, along with Bart Crashley, they were traded to the LA Kings by the Detroit Red Wings for Terry Harper, Don Maloney, and a second-round pick in the 1976 amateur draft. And right off the hop, this was a move that ended up paying dividends for Dionne, even though he was already a 100-point scorer previous to this point in time. Dionne never played in a playoff game, and that was the biggest thing as to why he wanted out of Detroit, was because they weren't making the playoffs then. You gotta remember, this is around the time that the Red Wings were the dead things. So that alone should say it all. And I mean, with goaltending solid, with Rogie Vachon, who we've previously talked about here, and additional scoring with Butch Goring, despite, significant injury to the Kings lineup, the Kings still managed to finish second in the North Division in Dionne's first season with the Kings. And while Dionne would lead the Kings in points for the 1975-76 season with 94 in 80 games played, he'd miss out on the top 10 in league scoring, just by a little bit. Now, 75-76 season would also see Dionne score his first, second, third, fourth, and fifth of 25 hat tricks as a Los Angeles King. And would also see him play in his first All-Star game as a Los Angeles King. And while the Kings did make the playoffs, however, well, they weren't nearly as hopeful as the Kings would have thought they would have been. I mean, despite outplaying the Atlanta Flames in the preliminary round, the Kings had no answers for the Boston Bruins. Despite 2 overtime wins, the Kings would lose in 7 games, with Dionne adding 7 points in 9 playoff games. Well, I mean, despite a first playoff run, I'd say that first season in LA went exceptionally well. Now, the 76-77 season was pretty much more the same for Dionne and the Kings. I mean, the biggest difference is Dionne scored 50 goals for the first time in his career, scoring 53 to go with his 122 points. Once again, good enough to lead the Kings, but also got him. The Kings finished second in the North Division, with Dionne finishing second in league scoring. So, I mean, they would have obviously tried to finish first if they didn't have the shadow of the 1976-77 Montreal Canadiens. That being said, the playoffs, well, they're pretty much a carbon copy of last season. They beat Atlanta in 3 games instead of 2, before losing to the eventual Stanley Cup finalists in the Boston Bruins in 6 games. And Dionne would put up a career high in 14 points in 9 playoff games, including a career high in 9 assists. We're already talking career highs in the playoffs. Now, for his regular season, Dionne was nominated to the NHL's first All-Star team, and because he only accumulated 12 penalty minutes, Dionne would be awarded the Lady Byng Memorial Trophy, his first as a King and the second of his career. Now, the 77-78 season would see 2 things happen, or rather, 2 players make their way to the Kings. Dave Taylor, a late 1975 draft pick and future video, and Charlie Simmer, who had signed with the Kings before the season began. Now, while the results of these aren't immediate, they're not far behind. Now, Dionne would finish the season with a team leading 79 points in 70 games. And the Kings, of course, they made the playoffs, of course, but would ultimately lose the preliminary round in 2 games to the Toronto Maple Leafs, with Dionne not even registering a point. Ouch, on two fronts. Now, the 78-79 season would see Dionne get that spring back in his step, thanks in large part to the startup of that Triple Crown line. With Taylor and Simmer, and it would really help Dionne score in buckets at this point, setting career highs with 59 goals to go with 130 points in 80 games. Now, again, leading the team and again finishing second in league scoring, but this time by only 4 points. So close, so close. And of course, the Kings would again qualify for the playoffs. And the playoffs, again, weren't necessarily that kind, seeing the Kings lose in the preliminary round to the eventual Stanley Cup finalists in the New York Rangers, with Dionne adding only 1 assist in 2 games. But again, for his regular season, Dionne would be nominated to the NHL's second All-Star team, and Dionne would also be awarded his first Lester B. Pearson Award, which was also, which we now know as the Ted Lindsay Award, as league MVP as voted on by the players. So it's always good to have that kind of recognition amongst the players you play against, or with, depending on the situation, I guess. Now, the 79-80 season would be Dionne's best season ever. This, of course, is when the Triple Crown was in full effect, which saw Dionne put up career highs in assists with 84 and points with 137. Now, along with his 53 goals, all offensive stats, that again led the Kings, but his 137 points would tie for the league lead in scoring. Now, on the way to second place finish in the Norris Division, the Kings would make a move at the trade deadline that may have cost them a deep playoff run. Maybe, but, hindsight is always 20/20, right? Kings traded Butch Goring to the New York Islanders. And I guess when you have the Triple Crown line, you have really no need for Goring, right? But in those playoffs, the Kings would meet those same Islanders in the preliminary round and would be out in 4 games to the eventual Stanley Cup champs, with Dionne contributing 3 assists in 4 games. Now, that all behind us. For his regular season, Dionne would be nominated to the NHL's first All-Star team for the second and last time in his career. He'd also be awarded his second Lester B. Pearson Award, and thanks to scoring 2 more goals during the regular season, he would beat out future GOAT Wayne Gretzky and be awarded the Art Ross Trophy for leading the league in points. It was inevitable he was going to get there at some point, and the fact that he had to tie Gretzky on that and came out on top, that's a feather in the cap any day of the week. The 80-81 season would be a dominant season for the Triple Crown line, with all 3 players scoring over 100 points. Now, Dionne again would lead the team with 135 points in 80 games. Dave Taylor would finish with 112 in 72 games, and Charlie Simmer would finish with 105 in 65 games. Now, if Taylor had scored 3 more goals, then all 3 players would have also scored 50 goals in the season. Now, statistically, Dionne finished second in league scoring. Taylor finished 5th, and Simmer finished 7th. It was the first time in league history that a line would score over 300 points in a season. So it's always good to be the first, even though they weren't the last. Dionne would also become the 13th player to score 1,000 points in a career, doing so on January 7th, 1981, in a 5-3 win against the Hartford Whalers. Now, the Kings did again finish second in the Norris, again, and were eliminated in the preliminary round, losing in 4 games to the New York Rangers, with Dionne adding 4 points in those 4 games. Now, for his season, though, Dionne would score his second NHL second All-Star team nomination for the last time as well. Now, the 81-82 season would see the NHL make some sense of their divisions and actually kind of give an effort to geographically realign them. So thanks to that, the Kings found themselves now in the Smythe Division, finally moving out of the shadow of the Montreal Canadiens, and now dealing with a new emerging shadow powerhouse in the Edmonton Oilers. Now, Dionne didn't miss a beat, though, managing to lead the Kings in scoring with 117 points in 78 games. Now, his 117 points put him 7th in league scoring, only 95 points behind the league leader. And, I guess 95 points is better than 105 points, right? Right. And the Kings would again advance to the playoffs and face the heavily favored Edmonton Oilers in the division semifinals. And a goal fest of a series. The Kings, losing Game 3 by a score of 5-0 at this point, is where you kind of cue that miracle music. And the Kings would rally back to score 5 to tie the game before winning it in overtime in what's now dubbed the Miracle on Manchester. And the Kings would ultimately take the Oilers to 5 games before losing in a very close 5-game series to the eventual Stanley Cup finalists, the Vancouver Canucks. And in 10 playoff games, Dionne would add 11 points, including a career high in 7 playoff goals. So he's having no problem making it to the playoffs, but it's getting beyond anywhere at this point. That's becoming the trick, right? The 1982-83 season would see the Kings take their first step backwards in a very long time. But it's not to say it wasn't without its milestones, as Dionne would become the 9th player in league history to score 500 career goals, scoring on Al Jensen of the Washington Capitals. And Dionne would lead the team in points with 107, which also good for 5th in league scoring. It was also the last time Dionne would score more than 50 goals in a season, when he would put up 56. Now, unfortunately for the Kings, they didn't qualify for the playoffs, finishing last in the Smythe division. The 1983-84 season wouldn't be much different than the previous year, and it would also be the last year for the Triple Crown line. But Dionne would also play in his 1,000th NHL career game and score his only penalty shot goal on March 9th, 1984 versus the Buffalo Sabres, while adding 92 points in 66 games. And again, the Kings would finish last in the Smythe division. Now, 1984-85 would see the Kings make a return to a form of being in a semblance of a competitive team, and also see Dionne prove he can still produce. This would also mark Dionne's 7th and final All-Star game as a member of the Kings, and would also see him score his last hat trick as a King on November 19th, 1984 versus the Calgary Flames. And again, Dionne would lead the Kings in points with 126 in 80 games played, which was good enough for 4th in league scoring. So, close. The Kings would make the playoffs after not qualifying for the previous 2 seasons, but the Kings would lose in 3 games to the eventual Stanley Cup champs in the Edmonton Oilers, with Dionne adding 3 points. Now, 2 things here. The most immediate is this would be the last time the Kings would make the playoffs with Dionne in the lineup, and Dionne's 126 points would be the last time in his career they would score over 100 points in a season. The 1985-86 season would see the Kings fall right back down to where they were before last season, but there was lots of potential in the lineup and on the way. Now, Dionne would finish the season with 94 points in 80 games, as the Kings would once again finish last in the Smythe division. Now, the 1986-87 season would be Dionne's last season in Los Angeles, and would see the Kings in the midst of a franchise-changing youth movement. Much like Dionne was mentored in Detroit by some of the vets that he had there, he became the elder statesman and started mentoring guys like Luc Robitaille, Jim Carson, and Steve Duchesne under his wing. But despite his rapport with the rookies, the Kings were, as mentioned, rebuilding. And Dionne, who did not want to be part of a rebuild, as opposed to a team upgrade, had asked to be traded to a contender. And with the Kings in danger of missing the playoffs again, Dionne was traded, along with Jeff Crossman and a 3rd-round pick in the 1989 entry draft, to the New York Rangers for Bobby Carpenter and Tom Laidlaw on March 10th, 1987. But in the 67 games he did play for the Kings, he contributed 74 points. Now, the funny thing here, and I don't know if it's funny or just odd, the Kings were in danger of missing the playoffs, but they made the playoffs anyways. Of course, so did Dionne when he was a Ranger, but that's beside the point. So that's the story of Marcel Dionne and his time in LA while wearing the number 16. So let's talk numbers. Alright, as far as regular season stats goes, 921 games played, scoring 550 goals, 757 assists for 1,307 points. As far as playoffs is concerned, 43 games played with 20 goals, 23 assists, and 45 points. Now, if we look at the accolades, 7-time representative of the NHL at the NHL All-Star Game in 1976, 1977, 1978, 1980, 1981, 1983, and 1985. He's a 2-time first-team NHL All-Star in 1977 and 1980, and a 2-time second-team NHL All-Star in 1979 and 1981. He's a 2-time recipient of Lester B. Pearson Award in 1979 and 1980, as well as a Lady Byng Memorial Trophy winner in 1977 and an Art Ross Trophy in 1980. Now, 7 100-point seasons as a Los Angeles King to go with 6 50-goal seasons. That in itself is impressive. As of this recording, he's still the team leader in points with 1,307. At the time he was traded, he did lead the team in goals and assists, both of which have been passed, and weirdly enough, not by anybody named Gretzky. He was named one of the NHL's 100 greatest players during the NHL Centennial season. He was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1992 and had his number retired by the Los Angeles Kings on November 8th, 1990. So, here's my opinion of the guy. Now, one has to think, if it weren't for Guy Lafleur going number 1 in 1971 amateur draft, I'm 100% confident it would have been Dionne. I mean, Dionne was number 2 overall in the 1971 amateur draft, but whether or not that would have helped the Kings' fortune at the time, I don't know. Now we're getting into redrafting, and I'm not going to attempt any kind of redraft. But he could do it all. He could set up the play, he could make the passes, he could score, he could hit, he could do it all. He could do it in bunches. Smooth hands. I mean, it's a shame you couldn't get those hands on the cup. Now, fun fact, when I started watching hockey, he was essentially the legend. I mean, points-wise, I mean, I think he's close to 1,700 when he retired. But, yeah, he was all points, all game, and all go. Of course, at the time I started watching hockey, he was a Ranger, and, you know, not putting up the same kind of numbers he was in previous seasons. I mean, all in all, he did wonders for the Kings as far as keeping them a playoff competitive team, as well as putting them on the map. You know, I mean, there's actually a 50-goal scorer and a 100-point guy in LA. Yeah, and it worked really well. It's just a shame they couldn't get past the hump and make their way to a Stanley Cup final. It would be nice to see Dionne at least compete for a cup. But lack of Stanley Cup aside, I mean, his time in LA was fruitful for himself and for the Kings. And if anybody ever deserved to have their number retired, it's Marcel Dionne. So that's another one of them Trev's hockey shows. I want to thank you for tuning in. Don't think I don't appreciate the gesture, especially if you made it to this point. And if you have made it to this point, just know that I appreciate you very, very much. So go ahead and hit that like button. I mean, if you want to say, hey, hit that like button. If you're digging what I'm doing, hit that like button. It'd be much appreciated. If you want that red button that says subscribe all over it, come on, you know you want to. You know I want you to. It'll make you feel good. It'll make me feel good. It'll help my algorithm. And I mean, we're pushing to 500. So let's help Trev hit that mark. If you want to, that link in the description, that'll take you to my Facebook page. Follow me there too. I'd love to build an audience on it. Let's move forward. Like I said, I'm setting up for the weekend. I'm planning on doing some filming, you know, this weekend, and hopefully some uploading by Monday. But either way, in the meantime, and in between time, be looking for videos from Trev. Later.